This is our final week of our Half-Truths series, and so I've got one last list of myths for you to take a look at. One of these statements is true, and two of them are false. A cockroach can live for weeks without a head. Birds die from eating wedding rice. Dog mouths are cleaner than human mouths. So one of those is true, and two of them are myths. So what do you think? What are your guesses? What now? The third one is true? The birds, that's true. Okay.
I say number one, cockroach.
Okay, we've got the cockroach. Number 3 is true. Okay. All right, so we got all kinds of opinions this time. You ready to know which ones are false and which one's true? The first one is true, and the second and third are false. Yeah. A cockroach can live for weeks without a head. What it eventually does die of is starvation, because you can't eat without a head. But birds, if you're unfamiliar with that second myth, the idea is that when the birds eat the rice, it gets warm and it expands and blows up their stomachs. But it doesn't get hot enough for it to do that inside of the bird. It doesn't affect the bird like that. I wonder if they choke on it. That might be a risk. But and then dog mouths are cleaner than our mouths. No, just no. I mean, seriously, I love dogs, but it completely grosses me out when people let their dogs lick their mouths. Gross. No, just no. Now, I think that by now you get the gist of what we mean by half-truths, but in case you've missed the last few weeks, a half-truth is something that's kind of true, but it really misses the mark. We've been talking specifically about Christian half-truths. Now, these are usually sayings that we have all come to believe and say as Christians, but when we set them against the standard of the Bible and historical Christian belief, they don't quite hold up completely. The last of these half-truths is one that I have often myself said over the years, and it's so much a part of my understanding that even I struggled to accept that it was just a half-truth. So here it is. Hate the sin, love the sinner. Let's start with what this half-truth gets right. Here's the first thing it gets right. Sin is serious business. Sin is deadly. It's an infection that God's trying to cure us of. It's a spiritual slavery that God's trying to free us from. Jesus himself says in the Gospel of John, "Very truly I tell you, everyone who sins is a slave to sin." And Paul built on that idea a little bit when he wrote, But thanks be to God, though you used to be slaves to sin, you have come to obey from your heart the pattern of teaching that has now claimed your allegiance. You've been set free from sin and become slaves to righteousness. Sin, evil, corruption, darkness, those are the very things that we as Christians are called to turn away from and resist. That's not to say that we're perfect or that we never sin. It does happen. Turning away from sin means choosing the light over the darkness on a day-to-day, moment-to-moment basis. And as we allow ourselves to be shaped and nurtured by God through spiritual disciplines like prayer, worship, and the reading of the Bible, we should find ourselves more and more being able to tell the difference between good and evil and be more and more empowered to make the right choice. The holy character of Jesus, as we're shaped by these practices, should become more and more a part of us all the time. Now, it is true we may occasionally still commit sinful acts, but that should be the exception and not the rule. Let's be clear about two things. Christians do sin occasionally. It happens. And I tell you this because if you do find yourself in a situation where you have given into temptation, I don't want you to doubt that you are a child of God, and I don't want you to give up on your faith. Get back on the horse and continue pursuing righteousness. But on the other hand, I want to also inform you of this. Sin should not be the norm for the Christian. I often hear Christians say, I sin every day, and in my mind I think, I hope not. I'm very concerned about your relationship with God if sin is a daily part of your life. I think what they really mean, I hope what they really mean, is I make mistakes every day. Let's make it clear, there's a difference between a sin and a mistake. We sin when we knowingly act in a way that harms the well-being of ourselves or others or dishonors God. That's what sin is. But we make mistakes due to non-moral factors. Maybe we're tired. Maybe we're distracted. Maybe we don't have all the information. Maybe we're attempting to perform a task that's uncomfortable or unfamiliar for us. Mistakes arise out of the natural limitations of being human. But sin arises out of moral and spiritual corruption. There's a difference between moral and spiritual wholeness and and absolute perfection. We'll never achieve absolute perfection, but moral and spiritual wholeness is the earthly goal of Christianity. Friends, Christianity promises a lot more than just freedom from sin's consequences, as huge as that is. Christianity promises an ever-increasing freedom from sin's influence and power. Remember the series From Darkness to Light a while back? Every time we choose to give in to temptation, we're drawn closer and closer to the darkness. And we might even find that eventually the darkness holds so much sway over our thinking that we actually decide to abandon following Jesus. Now, we also need to point out that some sinful behaviors can be habits rather than isolated incidents. When it's the case that you have a habitual sin that you engage in, it's possible that you have an addiction or a behavioral disorder that you need to seek professional help for. And there's no shame in that. Counselors, at least the best among them, are students of human behavior, thinking, and relationships. And the help that they offer can be an absolute, even life-saving gift of God. My point is this. The overall trajectory of the Christian life should be an ever-decreasing presence of sin and an ever-increasing presence of holy character. Sin is an ugly, destructive thing, something that we should run from with ferocity. So the problem with this expression, hate the sin, love the sinner, isn't so much with the first half as it is with the second half. And even in the second half, I still like the word love. It's the word sinner that should give us pause. Now, I get it. I get what this expression is trying to say. The point is that we should love people no matter how active sin is in their lives. The trouble with the saying is not its intended meaning, it's the wording. Now, I know that sometimes political correctness and arguing about words can be frustrating and even seem a little bit silly. But the fact is, when we label people, those labels usually come with an attitude. Just listen to the tone politically minded people use when even mentioning the political party they don't support. When we label people, we paint an entire group of people in broad strokes when the reality might be a lot more complicated and nuanced. Labeling people, painting them with broad strokes in every sense is what it means to judge someone. You may recall what Jesus said on that subject. He said, "Do not judge, or you too will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when all the time there's a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." To label people outside the community of faith sinners might be technically true, but it causes us to mentally categorize them, to paint them with broad strokes, to judge them. And that presents two dangers. First, and this is the main problem that Jesus addresses here, we can forget the remaining presence of sin in our own lives. We can forget that though we are pursuing holy character, almost all of us, if not all of us, are still working on it. We might be so busy picking on the speck in someone else's eye that we're ignorant of the plank in our own. Now, kids, if you've got the coloring page, go ahead and show it to the adults around you. Adults, if you're near one of the kids, try to take a look at the coloring page. It's a couple of images where where you have two people talking to each other. One's got a plank in his eye, and the other has just a little speck in it. Those images are pretty ludicrous. I'm sure they're very well colored, but the images themselves are pretty ludicrous. I mean, how ridiculous and foolish does the person with the plank in his eye look? But that's the mentality that we reinforce in ourselves when we label anyone else a sinner. Not only can we forget that we're all works in progress with our own wrinkles to iron out, but we can furthermore forget that any progress we've made has been not because of our own human efforts, but because of God's grace at work within us. It's not because of us. And that same grace is available to and at work within everyone, whether or not they've crossed the threshold and committed themselves to Jesus. In the early 2000s, Christian author Ted Decker wrote a series of fantasy novels called the Circle series. In those novels, something very strange happens to a man named Thomas Hunter, a washed-up writer from Denver, Colorado. Whenever he goes to sleep, he wakes up in another world, one in which the spiritual forces of good and evil aren't invisible realities, but they're very real and tangible. There's something you can see and touch. And in that world he goes to when he falls asleep, sin, evil, is a disease that causes the skin to turn white and scaly. By the third book, called White, a community of people called the Circle has been cured of the disease. Now, I won't tell you how they're cured of the disease because out of context it seems a little strange. You'll have to read the books for yourself. But Thomas is one of those who's been cured of the disease. He's a member of the Circle, but he gets captured by those who are still infected by this disease, and he's forced to be a slave to their princess. And as he gets to know her, he begins to see that underneath that disease is someone just like him. Someone loved by the Creator. And in spite of her disease, he begins to fall in love with her. We, the church, are the community freed from sin, but those who still remain slaves to sin are people just like us. They're people whom God loves. They're people for whom Jesus died, and people to whom God's grace has been made available. Yes, maybe they could technically be called sinners, but no more than you or I could be. We are better off thinking of them less as sinners and more as neighbors. Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself, and if you recall, the story he told of the Good Samaritan was the story he used to explain what he meant by the word neighbor. And the neighbor in the story is a Samaritan. Now talk about a group who would have been painted with a broad brush by Jesus' Jewish audience. Just to make sure that we see the distinction between seeing someone as a sinner and seeing someone as a neighbor. Let's take a quick look at a significant moment from the ministry of Jesus. Jesus knew how sinful the woman's past was, but he saw beyond it. He saw the person in pain behind the sin. That's why this expression is a half-truth. That's why it's a half-truth to say, love the sinner, hate the sin, because it's technically true, but it skews the way we look at others and maybe even ourselves. As we end this series, I'd like to do a quick review of these half-true expressions that we've gone over the last few weeks and suggest some alternatives that might hit the mark a little bit better. The first one we talked about was everything happens for a reason. So instead of everything happens for a reason, may I suggest everything God does, he does for a reason. Or maybe it may not have been God's plan, but He'll make a plan out of it. The next week we said, we talked about God helps those who help themselves. And that very week I suggested this as an alternative. God helps those who can't help themselves. God comes through for those who've reached the end of themselves. Yes, God calls on us to be personally responsible, but we have limits, and that's when God comes through for us. Last week we talked about God won't give you more than you can handle, and a more accurate alternative might be God will either keep you from breaking or be there to help pick up the pieces. And as for today's half-truth, hate the sin, love the sinner, might I suggest flee from sin and love your neighbor. Because that version of the expression helps us to focus on our own turning away from sin, on our own spiritual well-being, and when it comes to others, to focus on loving them. Now, loving them might mean helping them overcome sin in their own lives, but it may not. This expression helps us to focus on dealing with sin in our own lives and focus on loving others. So I hope that this series has been insightful for you. I hope that it's enlightened you to the subtle nuance of God's truth. These expressions are what they are, but they don't quite capture the fullness of the truth of God. I hope that now you see why maybe using these expressions aren't the best idea in every circumstance.